Good morning. I want to welcome you to the second day of GRCC's inaugural symposium on the history of gender and sexuality. And I want to, on behalf of the college, recognize the Social Sciences Department for their leadership in creating this symposium, which we are very proud of. And I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Susan Williams for her leadership in this initiative. We are very proud of this event and look forward to it continuing for many years. This morning's presentation is by Dr. Robert Hendershot. And I'd like to share some information about our presenter with you. In 2006, Robert Hendershot completed his PhD in transnational history in the joint program administered by Central Michigan University and the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. Prior to joining our faculty here at GRCC as its world historian in the fall of 2007, Dr. Hendershot taught at Grand Valley State University, Central Michigan University, and he also served a term as the managing editor of Peace and Change, a journal of peace research. In addition to teaching a variety of classes here at GRCC, Dr. Hendershot also coordinates the Irish Studies program, and he organizes an annual Peace and Reconciliation Conference. This past year, that conference featured Nobel laureate John Hume. An active scholar, Dr. Hendershot has published a book entitled Family Spats, Perception, Illusion, and Sentimentality in the Anglo-American Special Relationship. He has also published numerous articles in scholarly journals. His central field of study has been the role of culture and identity in 20th century international relations. But as a world historian, he has been able to pursue a variety of interests, and he has also spent many years researching the Anishinaabeg Native Americans of the Great Lakes region. Today, he'll be presenting a paper entitled Gender Variance and the Two-Spirited, Pre-Encounter Anishinaabeg Identity Construction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Hendershot.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Dr. Chesley, for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to be here this morning and speak with you on this topic, which is something that's been important to me for a long time. And I thought maybe I'd start by saying how I first began my research in the Anishinaabe in their identities and how that has changed from the pre-encounter period to the modern day. And it happened to me while I was in graduate school at the University of Central Michigan. And when you're in graduate school, you'll be thrust into a variety of different responsibilities. And one of them for me was to be a teaching assistant for a course on the history of Native America. And that was a new experience for me, but it's something that clicked for me right away, and I've often thought that had I not gone into researching primarily cultural and identity studies in international relations, that I would have been an Anishinaabe primary researcher. But anyway, while I was going to school at CMU, I was offered a position during the summer at a wonderful research facility that they have there called the Clark Historical Library, which is one of the greatest archives, in particular for Native American resources in northern Michigan and the Great Lakes region in general. And it was lovely for me to be able to find a summer position between semesters of teaching that would allow me to use my skills as a historian. And my job there, along with one other graduate student, Michael Phillips, was to go through an amazing collection of primary documents related to Michigan and its history. And they're called the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Collections. And this is a series of 40-plus volumes that were published between the 1870s and the 1920s. And every year, every couple of years, the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Society cranked out another one of these volumes. And it was their chosen responsibility, something that this organization chose for themselves, was to go around as early as the 1870s and start collecting accounts of earlier periods of Michigan's history. And within those many volumes, a lot of the sources, a lot of the primary documents and things that were reproduced there a lot of interviews that they had conducted and compiled into these collections, dealt with Michigan's Native Americans. But the problem was that these volumes were poorly indexed, and there was no usable biography for the researchers who had an interest in that. And so that summer, that was my job there at the Clark, was to go through, right, these 40 volumes in sort of a dank corner of the library and annotate, right, these collections with anything to do with Native America in general, and Michigan's Native Americans in particular. And that might not sound terribly exciting, but it was. Because what we found as we went through all these volumes was an amazing resource, right, on Native America, and not just their history during the treaty era, and not just their political relationships with the French and then the British and then the Americans, but rather a lot of the sources in those collections dealt with Anishinaabeg culture. And in doing that, we compiled a bibliography that I'm very proud to say has been of service to many scholars, as well as people who live in the center of the state on the Saginaw Ojibwe Reservation there. And it was enormously gratifying work, and it really did inspire me to keep going in my research on Anishinaabeg culture. And we found a lot of sources that particularly detailed gender in the Anishinaabe. And it became enormously clear to me that to really understand the Anishinaabe and to understand their history, you had to engage their gender as your primary field of study. And it's always been an excellent example for me of the centrality of gender studies, right, in any field of history. If you really want to understand a time period or a culture, right, gender is not an ancillary subject. Gender is the heart of the matter. And if you can understand a people and their gender roles, you'll understand that culture, you'll understand their worldview, you'll understand how they acted in the world as they did, because you'll understand how they perceived it. And so it's something that I've continued ever since, and for this talk, for example, I've used a lot of the primary documents that I came across right during that summer and then subsequently. And today I'm talking about, in particular, gender in the family of the pre-encounter Anishinaabe, and we'll also get into the two-spirited individuals of that culture, right, third and fourth genders of the Anishinaabe, and about, hopefully if we have time, how that dynamic changed over time, right, what happened to the pre-encounter culture of the Anishinaabe. So a good place to start then is just with an overview of the Anishinaabe themselves. Anishinaabe is the culture's term for themselves, right, and if you break down the word Anishinaabeg, well, I should say an individual is Anishinaabe, right? The culture, right, the plural form is Anishinaabeg with the G or sometimes a K sound on the end of it. But the Anishinaabe word, when you break it down, it means from whence lowered the species. But to the Anishinaabe people, it just means the people, right? It's their word for themselves. And it represents a culture, right, as well as a political alliance. Okay? The political alliance is sometimes more specifically referred to as the Council of the Three Fires, or the People of the Three Fires. And within the Anishinaabe culture, there are three distinct subgroups. And you will have heard of some of them, right? For example, how many people in the room have heard of Chippewa? Many of you. How many people have heard of Ojibwe? Excellent. Good. See, that's changing, because for many years, Chippewa was the most widely used term, but the term Chippewa is a mispronunciation of Ojibwe, is an error of history. Right? The people of the Ojibwe have always considered the appropriate name of their group to be Ojibwe. Chippewa comes later. It is an error of translation. The first Europeans that came to the Great Lakes region were the French as traders and missionaries, and then at that point in the early 1600s, the term Ojibwe passes into what is essentially early modern French. And then French is modernizing, and then from French, the term Ojibwe passes into early English, and then English modernizes, and then we get to American English, which is an entire other linguistic animal altogether. And along those centuries and through those cultures and languages, the term is morphed, you see. So from Ojibwe to Ojibwa to Chippewa to Chippewa, the term changes over time. And that's just one example of how the interactions in the Great Lakes region changed the Chippewa. I mean, in terms of identity construction, the very words that they used to describe themselves, right, and how others describe them is altered as well. Okay? But also within the Council of the Three Fires, right, you have the Ojibwe, you have the Potawatomi, and also the Odawa. Okay? And it is Odawa, it's not Ottawa. right? But Odawa is the proper pronunciation. These three groups are bound together right under the umbrella label, right, the umbrella culture of the Anishinaabeg. And they're very similar in many ways. For example, their languages, right, are all mutually intelligible. They're all in Algonquin dialect, right, of Ojibwayan or Anishinaabeg, and there are regional dialects within the three groups. But when they encountered each other in meetings, right, for example, on special islands during the summertime, they'd be able to understand each other's languages. They have similar cultural norms. They have similar gender roles, and they're always bound together politically, as well as in other ways. When the French came, when the British came, right, this alliance between the three cultures was never divided. Okay, unlike the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, right, further to the east in the lower Great Lakes region, the Three Fires Council always remained cohesive. But anyway, they are scattered throughout the Great Lakes region. And depending on where you're located, of course, the climate and the land itself will affect your lifeways. Okay, for example, the Ojibwe are the northernmost of the three groups, right? The Ojibwe, right, even within the Anishinaabe, right, the Ojibwe are the largest of the three communities. In fact, the Ojibwe are the largest Native American culture north of Mexico before the encounter and up to the present day. And they'd be in a lot of northern Michigan. Okay, in the lower peninsula of Michigan, you get Ojibwe culture in one place, which is here in the Saginaw Bay area. All right, and then throughout the upper peninsula as well, and along the north shores of Lake Superior, and then further into Wisconsin and Minnesota. Okay? The distribution of the Anishinaabe is vast, but it's generally more northern than the other communities. Right? The Potawatomi were located further to the south. I have a laser pointer. In this region of Michigan here, right, where the land is different, right? And for the Potawatomi, and then also in today's world, this is the breadbasket of Michigan, right? This is the concentration of agricultural activity. And the Potawatomi, of course, had a different climate than the more northern Ojibwe, and so the Potawatomi, for example, would spend more of their economy on farming activity than the Ojibwe would. But you'll find Potawatomi people throughout, much of southwestern Michigan, and then around the southern shores of Lake Michigan, right, throughout the region that modern-day Chicago has sprawled through. And then the Odawa are the smallest group, but again, culturally and politically connected to the others. The Odawa would be scattered throughout, right? The term Odawa itself means to trade. And the Odawa were always on the move, right, even more so than the other groups. And the Odawa were sort of a cultural glue, right, that held everyone together, because the Odawa were always trading with the other communities, and they're always bringing information and connection in a variety of ways. Okay? But the Odawa are the smallest, but they're very significant too. Okay? And for the culture, right, of the Anishinaabe, your life as a member of this culture would be very much set by the rhythm of the seasons. And it's important to understand, right, the climate, right, because the climate will determine the gender roles, and the gender roles will determine, right, people's identities in terms of what they contribute to society. That's what marked gender, right, for the Anishinaabe, right? Whatever you contribute to your community was the indicator of identity, was the indicator of gender in many ways. So, for example, with the Ojibwe, who are scattered right throughout, or distributed right throughout a lot of northern Michigan, and also through Ontario and further west into Canada and so on. In the summertime, right, when the earth is warm and the earth is awake, you have to prepare. Right, the winter weighs constantly on your mind. Right? Of course, winter when it comes. Right, imagine being a forest people right during this time period. That's going to weigh very heavily on your mind throughout the year. So during the summertime, you're preparing. During the summertime, the people would be hunting small game generally. The people would be fishing. Okay? They'd be congregated largely on the shores of the Great Lakes and along rivers, and they'll do net fishing as well as spear fishing, and the fish would be smoked and stored, right, for the winter. But also in the summer, you'll be doing a variety of gathering, which is equally important to the hunting and the fishing. Right? You have to have a balanced diet, right, to achieve health, and of course, balance is essential for the Anishinaabe. Right? A lot of their worldview divides into what is balanced and what is unbalanced, and therefore wrong. So you must have a balanced diet as well as pursue balance in every other area of life. And so hunting, fishing, and then gathering essential resources, grains and nuts, berries, honey. Okay, and a lot of that would be taken during the summer and enjoyed during the summer, but also stored for other time periods during the year. And when the fall comes, again, the rhythm of life will change. And often in the fall, the people will withdraw from the coastal areas more into the interior, and there they will do a good deal more hunting. Okay? It's in the fall for the Anishinaabe when you'll hunt larger game. Okay? And you know it's time to start getting ready for this right at the height of the summer, at the end of the summer, when the fireflies are at their thickest. Okay? This is the sign to prepare yourselves for the primary hunting season for larger game. You prepare your tools for hunting. You'll start to monitor the animals that you intend to hunt. And again, depending on where you are, those animals will differ. For example, in lower Michigan around Saginaw Bay, the primary animal for the fall would be deer. Further north, and the primary animal would be moose, right, where the snow is thicker and the moose will thrive. And then beyond that, even further north into Canada and further to the west, the larger animals would be caribou and sometimes buffalo. But anyway, that's the hunting season in the fall. And again, it's important to take just the right numbers, right, from the animal population, from the animal brothers and sisters. You don't wish to overhunt them because then the herd size will not be appropriate, and it'll be more difficult for you in the next season, right, if you overhunt in this season. Again, balance is a central philosophy in all things. Some of that food will be enjoyed in the fall, others of it will be stored. And during the winter time, right, you better hope that you've stored everything because the winter will be a struggle. You've stored fish, you've stored vegetables, you've stored plants of various different kinds, and of course you've stored meat. Okay. And in the wintertime, right, cultural life takes on a different activity. Right? When the sun goes down early during the winter months, the Anishinaabe people would be inside the lodge, right, for a longer period of time. And that would be the primary period of education for Anishinaabe people, right, especially the youth. Right? When you're in that lodge earlier, gathered around the fire for a longer period of time, that's the education season. That's when the elders of the community would tell the children about their identities, right, their cultural roles, and their obligations as members of that community, including their gender. And so yeah, the winter would be a struggle. In the spring, again, the cycle of life will change again. You'll move to a different area in the forest, and every spring, again, people would begin to gather maple sap. Right? And this is a family activity. They'd move into the interior and gather maple sap. Again, something that can be traded, something that can be boiled down right into maple syrup and then granulated into sugar, which is another important staple of the diet. Can be mixed with many foods, for example. Okay? So the rhythm of the seasons sets the life pattern. And by being a forest people, right, there's a lot of work that has got to be done. And that determines, right, what the men do and what the women do, right? Their obligations for survival, right, determine what must be done. And the Anishinaabe, in addition to organizing themselves into a political alliance and into subgroups, they'll also organize themselves by gender identities. Okay? In terms of community identity for the Anishinaabe, one of the most basic components of your identity was your clan. Okay? Everyone is born into a particular clan, right, in their community. Right? Most Anishinaabe people lived in bands consisting of between 20 and 25 families. And within that band of people, all the major clans would be represented. And the clans, right, the clan system, or totem, is a gift from the Creator, right, or the Great Spirit or Great Mystery, Gitichi Manitou. And all the different clans have a special gift. And you inherit your clan through your father's family. And so the Anishinaabe are patrilineal. They're not patriarchal. Right? There isn't this concept in the pre-encounter Anishinaabe that fathers rule heaven and earth. That does not exist for them. But they are patrilineal, right, in most cases, and you would inherit your father's clan. And that would determine your spiritual family. And it would determine the particular gift of everyone in that clan. For example, the Bear Clan was one of the largest ones, and the Bear Clan had particular gifts, right, that the people of that particular identity would emphasize and define themselves by. The Bear Clan's particular gifts are for medicine and protection. Which is kind of interesting, because if you travel to Anishinaabe reservations today and you go into the reservation hospital, right, you'll see the bear symbol displayed prominently. And the other, particular responsibility for Bear Clan people was for protection. So if you see a tribal police force on their badge, right, you'll see a bear. It's still a modern symbol for identity for people as well in this culture. Right. The Crane clan's particular gift was for leadership. The Martin clan's particular gift was for spiritual guidance. right? And every clan, right, had a particular gift. For the Fish clan, it was intellectualism, right? They were known as great thinkers, right? The Martin clan, their gift was to be warriors. For the Deer clan, their particular gift was gentleness. Okay? The clans balance each other out, right, in a nice way. You have to have all the different clans represented within your community to live the good life, or what the Anishinaabe people would call Mino Bimatazawin, which is an essential concept in that culture, right? Mino Bimatazawin means the good life. And that has many different components, right? But it all revolves centrally around this concept of balance, okay? The balance ideology permeates, right, life, right? There must be balance between the individuals in the community. There must be balance between, for example, husbands and wives. Right? As I say, there's not a gender hierarchy, right? And they would never think of it in terms of equality. Okay? Equality is a Western concept, right? For the Anishinaabe, right, their world, right, was focused on this primary value, right, this principal virtue that they defined as balance. And so men and women are not exactly the same, nor are they treated exactly the same, nor do they, perform the same function, but rather it's to be complementary, right? They share responsibility for the community, for the children, right, and for their world and its preservation in general. Okay? You must live in balance so that you leave a balanced world for those who will come after you. And this is called seventh generation thinking, right? Whenever the Anishinaabe people must make a decision, they'll always think of it in terms of the seventh generation. Okay? In terms of what we do today, right, how will that influence, right, the lives of our people 7 generations from now? Okay? So you live in balance now for the future, right, just as your ancestors lived in balance for you. An important feature of this society is sharing, or what an anthropologist would call reciprocity. And this takes place on many different levels, right? But in trade, for example, amongst the Anishinaabe, there is no profit motive prior to the arrival of the French in the early 1600s. There is trade, there's exchange of goods in the Great Lakes region before the arrival of Europeans, but without profit motive. Okay, so for example, during the summertime, people would congregate on special islands in the Great Lakes region, right? Islands that had significance to them, right? They have a religious history of their migration, right, from the Great Saltwater, the eastern coast of what is now, called North America. And they migrated along what we would call the St. Lawrence Seaway. And they stopped at special places along that journey, right? Particular islands, right, that were prophesied were for the people. Right? And they'll return to those islands, and they do today as well, right, during the summertime, for spiritual ceremonies, right, to gather with relatives and friends, for political meetings, and of course also for trade. And when trade took place, the trade was done as a system of mutual benefit. Okay? So, for example, right, the Ottawa might show up and they might have a surplus of maple sugar. Right, and then a group of Potawatomi might be there at Madeline Island or Manitoulin Island, right, 2 of the holiest islands for the culture, and they might have a surplus of dried whitefish or sturgeon. And then you exchange, right? They would discuss it until you determine how much of this product is worth an equal amount, right, of this product, and then you exchange, right, without an attempt to generate profit. That's absent from them. Okay, it's absent from this culture. And then the idea is that now you have a supply of both resources, and so the quality of life has become better. Okay? And within them, the people that you know particularly well, right, it's general reciprocity, right? You can borrow from people that you know every day, right, from your sister or from your brother or her family, right? You can take what you need from their lodge with the understanding that it doesn't have to be paid back immediately, but over the course of your lives together, right, it will balance out, right? You take and give as necessary, right? And that's a source of community responsibility and interconnection. Between peoples who don't know each other particularly well, you might see each other a few times a year. That's more balanced reciprocity, right, where you measure out the various goods and exchange immediately. Okay, and then there's also, of course, a concept for the Anishinaabe of negative reciprocity, or poor sharing, right? People who refuse to contribute equally and always take more than they provide. And this would be a principal error in a principal moral failing. Right? It's very un-Anishinaabe to live outside of the balance in this way. And you could, if you were warned and continued to disregard that, someone who refused to live in balance with their community could be ostracized from the community. And of course, in the winters of the Great Lakes region, that would mean the end of you. So it's a very important thing, right? And it's a cultural ideal that everyone's raised with from birth to live in a balanced way. In terms of material culture, just very briefly, right, this is an example of an Anishinaabe lodge. It tells us a lot about their material culture and how they've adapted to life in the Great Lakes region. Sometimes the lodges, or wigwam, okay, of the Anishinaabe are conical, right? Other times they're more of a dome structure, right, pictured here. But the lodges could be sometimes quite large, right? You might get several family units within one. If we had a larger one, it would be hard to fit between the screen and the front row of seats there, and it would be a tight squeeze. But it's often made of birch bark over a wooden frame right underneath. Right, the birch bark, the birch tree is something that's used by the Anishinaabe for a lot of their material culture. Okay, and then within the lodge, right, seated within the lodge, right, of course in the center there's a fire which would be going all year round. In the wintertime, the fire would have to be larger, and there's a hole in the top to allow the smoke to escape, but the heat would be retained, right, by the circular structure. And you'd cook at it sometimes, right, in the winter when you had to. Normally in the summer you'd cook outside. But in the wintertime you have it for warmth. In the summertime you've got that fire going inside all the lodge to keep the bugs out. But especially in the colder months of the year, right, the seating structure, right, the cultural, patterns in seating structure are very important. Okay, the husband of the lodge, right, would sit far from the door and look out the door, right? The wife of the lodge would sit near the door, and then sons and daughters would sit, nearer to the father, right? If they're sons, and then daughters would sit closer to the mother. The smallest children and the elderly would be positioned, right, on an interior ring, right, closer to the fire themselves, right? Children and the elders are enormously valued, right, for their future, right, in the various generations. Is always emphasizing the importance, right, of protecting, right, the young and the old. Okay? And that throws the small children and the elders together inside the lodge, right, and that's convenient for, as I say, right, during the period of education during the winter months. Okay? In the very hot times, right, there would be a mesh on the lower level. You could strip off the lower sheets of birch bark, and in the summertime, for example, the breeze could blow through the lower mesh and keep the lodge cool. But it would be made comfortable inside, right? It's not just a bare, earthen floor, but rather it's covered with skins of deer and bear and so on. Now, as to the gender identity of the Anishinaabe, this is one thing that makes them very interesting, okay? As many of you will know from your work in other college classes and so on, gender is a social construct. Right? It's not the same thing as sex or biology, but rather it's something that is socially constructed in the mind. It's an idea, right, that determines how people think about themselves and how people think about others. And the Anishinaabe are extremely interesting for their gender roles, right, broadly. But particularly I've always found them interesting because they don't have one or two or three genders, but rather they have four. Okay, they have four distinct genders in their culture. Okay, you have men living as men, you have women living as women, you have women living as men, and men living as women. Okay? And all the genders are intimately a part of the community, right? Nobody, right, of any gender lives their lives on the margins of society. Right? All these genders are focused on and recognized and appreciated, right, in that community. Okay? So they have four genders, but really only two sets of gender roles. Okay? In terms of what is masculine gender roles and what is considered feminine gender roles or gender behavior, you can divide this right into two categories. Right? So a man living as a woman, right, is for all intents and purposes in that culture, right, a woman. Right? And you'd recognize that by what they contribute, right, to the culture, right, by the work that they do. Right? That's what this gender is about. Okay? So in terms of gender roles, right, to begin this discussion, to start breaking this down, things that are considered masculine. Right? What would the men do, right, in Anishinaabe culture? Right? For example, men would do the larger game hunting. Right? That's part of their cultural responsibilities. Okay? And of course, here I'm also talking about women who lived as men, right, as well as men who lived as men. Right? They hunt larger game. The men also would do the fishing. Okay? And they would fish with spears and nets, but then they'd also crack the ice and do ice fishing in the wintertime. The men were responsible for representing their communities to other communities, which I've thrown under the label here, diplomacy. They're responsible for representing their communities to other communities. And when they do that, right, they don't have the powers of, for example, a monarch, right? The Anishinaabe don't have the office of chief, right, before the arrival of Europeans. Okay, rather what they have is someone called Ogima, right? Maybe some of you are aware that we have an Ogima County here in Michigan. But what Ogima means is speaker or representative. And all political decisions for the Anishinaabe are taken in council. And when the council needs to represent their council or opinion, right, outside of their band, right, they would nominate a speaker to represent that. And the speaker can only agree or disagree based on what he's been told by the council. Okay? And inside that council, of course, all politics are made by, or all decisions in politics are made by consensus. There is no voting. Okay? This is not majority rule, right? Indian politics are laborious by design, and they take a long time, right, by design. Right? Again, it must be balanced. Right? Everyone must speak. Okay? And in the councils that empower the speaker, in those councils, right, it's every adult in the community, right, men and women. Okay? But the speakers that they nominate that's considered to be a masculine gender behavior. Defense of the community, right, to be a warrior, right, to be someone who defends the community is also considered to be masculine. Okay? Men will make tools that men use. Tools for hunting, tools for fishing, and so on. Right? Men make tools that men use. And this can also apply to items for personal connection. Right? For example, the individual here is holding his pipe, which is a personal item for him and a spiritual item. Okay? A pipe is not merely an object, but it's a connection. It's your personal connection between this world and the next. Right? Between the world that you see and the world that you believe. Right, it exists in a spiritual sense. Right? The pipe is a living thing. It needs to be fed, it needs to breathe, it needs to be cleaned. Right? And it's, by burning kinnikinnick or tobacco, right, the smoke, right, carries your prayers to the great mystery. Okay? That smoke merges between this world and the next. Okay? So men make the tools that men use. And many people in the Anishinaabe, depending on, again, where you live in the Great Lakes region, will do quite a bit of farming. The Potawatomi, for example, are the people of the Anishinaabe who do the most farming, because again, their land is best suited for it. And it's not merely gardening, right? Their farms, right, could be between 5 and 25 acres, depending on the size of their band. And so this is a very central activity for them in an economic sense. And so the women will do the farming, right, but the men will cut the trees. Again, the balance between the genders, right, is to be complementary, right? It's to function together for the greater good of the community, right? You divide tasks along gender lines, right, for the greater good. Okay? So the men will cut trees, and for the women, right, in terms of what is considered to be feminine gender behavior, right? What is feminine is gathering those essential resources, right, throughout the year. And this would include, items for consumption, right, in fruits and nuts and honey and so on. But also in terms of gathering, you would gather plants and herbs, right, that had a medicinal value. Okay, often the women were the healers, and they understood the spiritual component of healing as well as what materials were required, right, and then other things that the people would need as well, right, things that you'd have to build. Bags and birch bark containers for storing things, right, called a mokuk. They would gather all these needed resources, right? The birch bark that would go into the lodge was gathered by the women. Farming, right? The women would be responsible for farming, planting and monitoring the crops, and then bringing them in, right, when they were ripe. In terms of construction, right, the women built the lodges as well as assembled the materials for the lodges. And the lodge was, and again, property is mutually held, but the lodges were the women's responsibility. So construction, right, as well as other, structures that the people needed beyond basic housing. For example, religious structures, right, would usually be built by women. They would prepare hides, right, for clothing, which is another responsibility that they had. But again, right, a division of gender, right? The men will hunt, right, and women living as men will hunt larger animals, right, and procure the hides of bear or deer or moose and so on. And then it's the women's responsibility to take the hides from the men and do their share, right, of the labor as well. Again, it's to be balanced. Okay? In both labors, right, both parts of this process, both contributions are equally valued, right? One means nothing without the other. Okay? There's not a cultural judgment as one activity being somehow less than another. Okay, so the women will take the hides and they'll scrape the hair off one side and the fat and the sinew off the other, and then treat it, right, in such a way. And this would be something that is a long process, a scientific process that must be taught, right? To take the hide of a deer and to make it soft and to make it nice, right, for clothing, right? You'll treat it, right, with minerals and with usually it's the brain of a deer that will prepare that, make it a nice soft leather. Childcare is a responsibility for feminine gender behavior for the Anishinaabe. And the Anishinaabe would use bundling, moss bed bundling, and they would also use the cradle boards as well. The women, feminine gender behavior, included preparing meals for the community. Women make the tools that women use. Women make the clothing, as I say. And the women would do hunting as well, right? But they would do smaller scale hunting, right? That is to say, they would hunt smaller animals. And they would hunt them near the lodges, okay? In terms of women who are pregnant or women who are caring for small children, right, it's often considered by the Anishinaabe more difficult, right, for them to go out and hunt larger animals, right, to be gone for several days at a time, hunting, elk or caribou or whatever. And so they would do hunting as well, but they would hunt with snares, right, closer to the lodge, right, where they could still care for children and so on, and then do the other, contributions usually associated with the feminine. And so it's by your activity and by your contributions to the society that determines, right, your gender identity. Okay? And that's a central concept, right, for understanding Anishinaabe gender. There are also jobs that men and women did together, and I like them because they also, focus on this concept of balance that is so central. Okay? For example, Anishinaabe people would gather rice in the fall, right? Wild rice. And in certain places of the Great Lakes region, you do get, rice waters. Okay? Wild rice grows. This photo here is from northern Minnesota, and this is an excellent example of a rice lake. And when it's time for the rice to be gathered, it's in the stalk, right, that comes up out of the water, and it's ripe, it's ready to just fall out of that stalk. And this is a social experience for the Anishinaabe. Okay? This is something that men and women will do together. And often it's something that is eagerly anticipated by the young. Right? This is, for the Anishinaabe, this is kind of like a date. Okay? And who you ask to go in the canoe with you during ricing season is a socially loaded experience. I mean, this is tense, okay? Because it's two people who go in the canoe during ricing season, all right? And they would face one another in the canoe, one person in the front and one person in the back. And the person in the back, guides the canoe through the shallow rice waters. And the person seated in the front of the canoe, right, and it could be a man or a woman in either position, but the person seated in the front of the canoe faces right towards the back, and so you can have a conversation, right, while you do this. But then the ricing is done with two long sticks, right, two long ricing sticks, like so. And the person in the front, right, for example, if I'm in the front in the canoe, right, and the other person is where the podium is, or it might be a much bigger birch bark canoe. But I have two ricing sticks, and with one of them I'll comb the rice right on the sides of the canoe over the central well of the canoe, and then I'll thresh with the other one. Okay? And then the rice will fill in the canoe, and we'll spend the day doing this. Okay? And it's something that young people would do, right, as a type of courtship, right, something that you're kind of off on your own doing, and you can have a private conversation. It's something that husbands and wives would do as well. Okay? For children who have not yet reached puberty, often brothers and sisters will do it together. It's something that men and women do together in this culture. Also, making maple syrup and maple sugar is something that entire family units would do, right? Men and women did this process together because it's so important. And it's, it's a very labor-intensive thing, right? To gather the syrup, right? To gather the sap of the trees and then to boil it and keep that fire going and supply the wood and gather the sap and so on. This is a long process. And the families would do it together, and it's like a holiday season, right? When the sap starts to flow. Making snowshoes is something that husbands and wives would do, right, for their family. A very important tool for the Anishinaabe, right, throughout much of the year. You've got to have snowshoes, right, for yourselves and for your children, right, and it takes more than one pair of hands to do this effectively. And so it's a parenting activity. Okay. Making canoes, right, the birch bark canoes are extremely important for the Anishinaabe, and a big part of their culture depends upon this, right, for traveling to the spiritual islands for meetings in the summertime. For doing fishing, right, for hunting, and for gathering rice, right? You depend on the canoe a lot. And again, this is a family activity. Okay? So some of the most important things for the society are done by both men and women together. Okay? You'd find a nice long piece of birch bark, right, and then you'd soak it in the water until it becomes pliable. And then you'd dig out a section of earth and fill it with sand. And then you'd press your wet birch bark into it, right, until it starts to take the shape of a canoe, and then you do other carpentry around it and then sew it together. And it'd take several weeks, right, to do this, and it would, again, it's a family experience, right? The men and the women share different responsibilities for different parts of construction for the canoe, but it's something that they do together. And then likewise, politics is something that men and women did together, right, for pre-encounter Anishinaabe culture. It's something that is extremely important. It's something that they share responsibility for. Every adult in a clan, right, will be expected to sit in part of the clan council and to share their views. Right? Everyone is to be heard from, right, when you're debating any issue at all. And some people can speak at length. Others can just simply say, I agree with so-and-so. Right? But they share responsibility. Okay? Everyone has to be heard from. And if somebody disagrees, you keep talking until everyone agrees. Right? It's very similar to my department meetings right here with my colleagues and friends in the social science department. Right? Keep talking until everyone agrees. Right? Anything else won't do. I wish. And women could hold great political power. Right? They're enormously influential. And I have an example of this from one of the documents, right, that I've come across. And this woman's name is Netnokwa. And Netnokwa was a very revered individual, and she had enormous influence over her community. And she shows up in a lot of the different sources from her time period, right, which was, most of the sources date from the 1790s and the very early 1800s. And one of the things that makes her famous is because of John Tanner's account, right? And John Tanner is a notable Michigan author, right? John Tanner was taken captive as a young man when he was about 7 years old, when his family, right, his white settlers, right, were living along the Ohio River, far south of Michigan. And he was taken captive, right, by an Ojibwe raiding party, right, to replace a son that had died of the smallpox. And he is then traded several times, right? And the first family that adopted Tanner, the husband took Tanner as a replacement for his deceased son, who was about Tanner's age. All right, the son had contracted smallpox and died unexpectedly. And this man's wife was grief-stricken. She wanted her child back. And in her grief, she demanded of her husband that he return her child to her. And so the husband went and took John Tanner, right, and brought him to the Anishinaabe community. And this was a difficult time for Tanner. He didn't have a good experience there. The mother wanted to love him, but the father always resented him. So ultimately that initial family didn't work out, but then Tanner was traded, right, to a more benevolent mother, and that was Netnokwa. Netnokwa is a prominent figure in John Tanner's narrative, right, which is simply called the Falcon, right, which was his Anishinaabe name. Right? Eventually he will become Anishinaabe, right, in all practical cultural ways. Right? He becomes part of the culture, and then later on we'll write about it. Right? But his name is the Falcon, Shashawa Nebase, right, the Falcon. And he describes the transition from his initial Ojibwe family to Netnokwa's family. And he describes Netnokwa in particular, and he absolutely had the greatest love for her, the greatest love and respect. And she was an Odawa woman who lived amongst the Ojibwe, right north of Mackinac. And she had great influence. Okay? And one of the first things that Tanner recalls about her, right, in his account is, quote, "Notwithstanding her sex, she was then regarded as a principal leader of the Ottawas," end quote. So he right away recognizes, right, as a newcomer to this culture, that Netnokwa exercised enormous influence over people. And he'll continue to comment on that, right, throughout his source. Right? Quote, "I have never met an Indian, either man or woman, who has had so much authority as Netnokwa. She could accomplish whatever she pleased, either with the traders or the Indians, probably in some measure because she never attempted to do anything which was not right and just." He loved her and respected her, and also had to appreciate, right, that she commanded more influence than any other man in the Anishinaabe culture that he ever came across. Women could wield great influence. And that's very Anishinaabe, because for the Anishinaabe, you don't inherit power, you don't inherit title. It's all based on who you are as an individual, okay? Man or woman, right? It's both. Okay? Netnokwa is a great example of that. Right? So she had authority and influence. Part of that is also in a spiritual sense because Netnokwa was renowned as a dreamer. Right? She would have dreams that would have meaning and would be interpreted as a guiding force for that community. Right? She would dream where the game was. And then she would send her adopted son Tanner, right, to hunt it, right, in the morning. And he would find it there. And right in the wintertime, right, that skill has great power and influence over how people think and what they do and whom they, look to for guidance in moments of crisis. Okay, so in politics as well, right, both men and women could exercise great influence. In terms of the family, your family unit as Anishinaabe people is extended but close. Right? It's several living generations as well as a connection with your ancestors and also, of course, thinking of your future family as well. Right? Several generations from now, people you'll never meet. Right? You must think of them too. Okay? And everyone in your family has a particular responsibility or a special responsibility to other members of the family. For grandparents, they were the educators. Right? They taught the children, right, their philosophy. Right? They would emphasize the principal virtues of the Anishinaabe. They would teach them about, for example, what are the chief wisdoms, right? Love, virtue, balance. Okay? They would teach them about their gender roles and their clan responsibilities and their spiritual beliefs, right? The creation of the world and what that means to the people. Okay? The grandparents were philosophers. The elders were teachers. Okay. From the child's perspective, right, other members of your extended family also have enormous influence over you, right, and responsibilities, right? Aunts and uncles have great responsibility for the children, right, because they're in charge of discipline for their nieces and nephews, not the parents, right? They don't punish. Okay? And in general, the Anishinaabe didn't really believe in overt punishment, right? There's no, striking of the children, for example, right? That's considered a big no-no for the Anishinaabe. But, right, if somebody does wrong, right, sometimes children, if they don't share properly, if they exhibit negative reciprocity, right, there has to be some repercussion for that. All right, and so it's not wait until your father or wait until your mother gets home, right? It's wait until your uncle gets back or wait until your auntie gets back, and they decide the punishment. And this is a nice way to do it because sometimes parents can be biased and they might favor one child over another, okay? By placing this responsibility for discipline with aunts and uncles, they still love you, they still care for you, but there's just that little bit extra distance between them and the subject of the discipline to ensure justice, okay? There's less bias, right? And so, again, you have got to balance all these things out just so. The mother and father were teachers as well, right, for the children, and they would teach daily life activities. They would teach how-to kind of activities. For the children of the Anishinaabe, your childhood would go through several different stages of instruction. Okay? They had 3 distinct stages of child-rearing. To begin with, you'd be in the infant stage, right, between birth and maybe age 3. Okay, and this would be characterized by 3 years of nursing, which for the Anishinaabe was just about right. Okay. 3 years of nursing, right, for 3 reasons. One, it's healthy. Right? The Anishinaabe believed in the health of breastfeeding. Okay? 2, it creates a strong bond between mother and child, which is essential. And 3, right, when a woman is breastfeeding, she is less likely to become pregnant again. And so by using 3 years of nursing, this is a way to space births apart. Right? It's not foolproof, right, but for the Anishinaabe, 3 years between births was just about right. And that's how they would space that during a woman's childbearing years. Okay. The next stage, around 4 or 5, they start to divide the children's education along gender lines. And by this time, for example, little girls are spending most of their daytime with their mothers and their aunts, and little boys would be spending most of their time with their fathers and with their uncles. Right? And you start to prepare them at this young age for what their contributions to the society is going to be. Okay? And when you're 4 or 5, and you see this in many cultures, they'll begin mimic play. Okay? What's mimic play? An example from your own lives.
What they see.
Sorry?
Whenever another child see an adult doing, they'll do what they do.
Okay, you might mimic another child. Good. And what if you mimic your parents' gender roles? Please.
Playing house.
Good. Yeah, and what kind of toys do you use when you play house? Good. Sorry?
Housekeeping tools.
Housekeeping tools. Good. Yeah. And you can go in Toys R Us right now and you can find lots of different toys that would help children with that game, which is fun. That's the point of it. Right? But you might find dolls, you might find easy bake ovens, right? For little boys, you'll find lawnmowers. And no longer I don't think in our culture, right, are the gender lines so strictly applied, right, to little boys or little girls playing with any of these particular items. I think there's more flexibility there, at least I'd hope so. But the idea of mimic play is something that you find in many cultures. And the Anishinaabe had that as well. Dollies, for example, corn husk dolls, right, is a common item of play for Anishinaabe girls. Okay? And you can see that, this dolly here is a corn husk, and it's about yay big. And somebody spent a lot of time onto this, right, because it has real hair. Right, it's got a buckskin, clothing. It's decorated with beadwork. It even has, of course, perfect little moccasin on, right, or shoes. Okay, and of course, for the Anishinaabe, right, no mimic play doll could ever be complete unless, of course, right, it has the toy cradle board that was built to go with it. Okay, it must be both. Right? They go together, right? One is nothing without the other, right? And this is how you prepare them for adult life. And so imagine an Anishinaabe mother, right, doing about her work. She might have her smallest child, right, in a cradle board on her own back, right, as she does her contributions to the community. But also, right next to her might be a 4-year-old child, right, with a dolly, right, in a cradle board on her back, right? And you mimic, right? You learn your adult roles, right, as you play as a child. For little boys, right, of course, there would also be, particular, mimic play toys, right? Toy bow and arrow, for example. In Anishinaabe ceremony and celebration, right, there is music, and the principal instrument is the drum. And it will be most often men who do the drumming, okay, at celebrations and religious ceremonies. And so tiny little boys, before little boys can even walk, right, their fathers and their uncles are giving them drums to beat it. Games as well, and boys and girls would play games, right? This isn't so much mimic play, but it's connected with it. When you meet in the summertime, right, at Madeline Island or Manitoulin Island, right, Indian hockey, right, lacrosse was the most popular sport. And there's several different variants of it, right, throughout the Great Lakes region. But it could be played with a ball, right, and a stick with a cup carved in the end, but also it could be played with 2 deer hooves, right, dried and connected with a piece of leather, right, and then you just need a stick, and then you can whip it. You can catch the game piece and hurl it again, right, in one swift movement. It's very exciting to watch. But children play this, and then adults will play this. But, the idea when communities meet and get together, children from one band start playing with the children of another band. They're going to be dealing and having relationships with these people throughout the course of their lives, right, in trade and in politics and when they take over the alliance. And so they start preparing them for that interaction with other communities from the time that they're very small. And then when you reach your teen years, you'd enter the 3rd stage of education or 3rd stage of childhood. And when you get to be this age, you would ask for and receive special training from an elder. Okay, you'd ask for and receive special training. People become renowned for having particular gifts and skills, and that might be medicine, that might be farming, might be hunting, might be preparing hides or building the best lodges. And when you come of age, right, before you're considered to be an adult, right, you have to ask for and receive special training. And after that training process is complete, and the elder decides when that is, when they have given you everything you need to know, right, to carry that information to the next generation, then you've reached adulthood, and then you may marry. And that's true for both men and women. Okay? So you ask for and receive special training, right? There's an accumulated knowledge and science that goes with this. Okay, so within these masculine and feminine roles, and within the families, right, the family structure, as I say, there are 4 genders. Okay? And you've got, as I say, men living as men and women living as women. But then in addition to that, you have what the Anishinaabeg call Nijmanaduwag, which means 2 spirits. Okay? Nijmanaduwag. And the 2-spirit people are just that, right? They have spirits of the male and spirits of the female, right, inside of them. And that makes them special. Okay? And there are several different words that are being used, throughout this time. Today, the most common term used to describe these genders is 2-spirit, or the 2-spirited, right? Nijmanaduwag. Since the early 1990s, the prevalence of that term has become almost universal. But if you go further back into time, right, you'll see other words being used in different regions of the Anishinaabe world. Agokwa was used for a long time, for example, to represent a man living as a woman, right? It means man, woman, or genitaled woman. Similar words, right, for women living as men, right? The Anishinaabe word for a woman living as a man is warrior woman, okay? But anyway, these are special people, okay, in these communities. And it's important to note that this is different than sexual orientation. That's not what I'm talking about here. Okay? Words like sexual orientation, right, they don't have a translation in the Anishinaabe language. Many non-natives have misinterpreted it, the 2-spirit, right, as referring to people with, as referring to homosexual people. But in fact, that's not true, right? It's the ceremonies and practices, right? They're based on how the different genders are manifested, and not on sexual preferences or practices. Okay? It's by what you contribute to the society. Okay? People who had 2 spirits are considered to be gifted. This is a special thing. Okay? It's not common, but it's not rare either. Okay? They carry both spirits. Women might, for example, engage in tribal warfare and marry other women because they're living as men. Okay? It's heterogender, not heterosexual. It's heterogender, right? They're living as men, right? So they'd marry women. Likewise, there are men who would form partnerships and marry other men because they are living as women. Okay? So these individuals are looked on as 3rd and 4th genders respectively. Okay? They are honored and they are revered. And they would have, in addition to the other gender roles we talked about, right, there are particular gifts and particular roles that the people of the Anishinaabe would see and anticipate in the 2-spirited. For example, the 2-spirited are often revered as visionaries. They're often revered as people who have intrinsic knowledge of healing. They're medicine people. Right? Often the 2-spirited in the community will be the caretakers of orphans and caregivers, right, to the sick or to the elderly. They're respected, right? They're fundamental components of this culture. The Nijmanaduwag do not exist on the margins of Anishinaabe culture. Right? They're firmly placed at the center of it in many ways. And often within the Anishinaabe, the recognition of the individual who possesses both spirits would take place at a young age. And this would happen in a variety of different ways. But if, for example, right, someone starts to recognize a child as a potential 2-spirit, there are several ceremonies that would be used, right, to determine this. Okay? If parents, for example, notice that a son is less interested in boyish play or manly work than the other boys in the community, they would hold a special ceremony to determine how the child would be raised and how the child would be taught. They'd make an enclosure of brush, okay, a brush enclosure, right, that would be over the child's head. And inside of the brush circle, it had only one way in or out. they would place 2 items, and it might be a bow, right, and an ash splint basket, right, which is usually a tool of those who gather, right, or women. And they would send the child inside. And once the child is inside, right, he'll see the 2 items and not know. They told him to bring 1 item out. When the child is going inside, they light fire to the brush circle. And the child will then have an immediacy, right? He'll have to choose, right, without thinking. And if he comes out with the basket, right, then the people of the community recognize and resign themselves, right, that this is indeed a 2-spirited person and should be raised as such. Okay, so things like that, and also there are others, right? There are song circles and dances that would help to determine this on a spiritual level, right? This is a spiritual thing to be 2-spirited. Okay? And so then that person who is determined as a 2-spirit would be raised as a 2-spirit, meaning that they would be taught to do women's work as well as men's work, okay? Because they are both, right? They have both spirits, and therefore, are special in that way. Okay? Similar rituals would be used to determine if women, were 2 spirits. Okay? Children of both genders would, spend time with healers, okay, who are often 2 spirits themselves. Right? And so there's a parenting dynamic for the 2-spirited, right, within Anishinaabeg culture. Okay? But above all, right, their childhood is marked by acceptance and understanding. Okay? This is recognized, this is understood as an important thing. And as adults, the 2-spirited were people of power. They were people who had the ability to see, right, in a spiritual sense. They had the ability to see with the eyes of both men and women, both biological men and biological women. And they're often called upon to be healers, dreamers, to interpret the dreams of others. They're often called upon to be namers. Right? When a child is born, right, who you ask to name the child is a great honor, right, and it represents that child's spiritual identity. And often you'd ask a 2-spirited person to do your family that honor. Okay? They would do things in general, right, that are, devoted to the welfare of the group, as healers and caretakers and dreamers and namers. Right? They're very much devoted to the welfare of the group, and that comes to be expected. In everyday life, the 2-spirited would wear articles of both male and female clothing. Okay? That would determine how they dress. Right? They'd have articles of both in terms of what was appropriate. Right? A 2-spirit male, right, that is someone who's a man living as a woman, would do largely women's work, but then there's also variance here. There's flexibility here. And that's another amazing thing about the Anishinaabe is based on the available data, the available resources, the 2-spirit experience is varied and diverse. You would do lots of, the work that the culture usually considers to be feminine, but you'd also still be able to do masculine work. You might partner with another person in your community, or you might choose to remain single. Right? But if you choose a partner, right, if you're a man living as a woman, right, then you are a woman in that community, and you would choose a man. Okay? Again, the balance between the genders is an essential concept. Okay? Very different from homosexuality as people know it today, right, in Western culture. Right? 2-spirit individuals lived within the gender norms of the Anishinaabe. Okay? That was their world. Generally, 2-spirits, 2-spirit males are not expected to have sexual relations with women, for example. No. Okay. And there are multiple examples of this in history, and again, I can go back to Tanner's narrative for eloquent examples of Ojibwe culture, right, in the 1790s and after. I have his image available. This is Tanner. He's always struck me as an interesting person, right? His life is an interesting story, abducted as a child and then becomes Anishinaabe in every way, but often, feels interest in the white world, right, that he only knew as a small child, and when he's later in life, in his 40s, right, he'll return to the white world and try to seek understanding, find out what happened to his family. Ultimately, he'll never be fully accepted, right, by the white culture in North America. And then toward the end of his life is a mystery. He'll disappear back into the forest and return to life as an Indian, as an Anishinaabe, as Ojibwe. But anyway, right, Tanner's account tells us a lot of things about this, and he also includes a discussion of the 2-spirited. I find his image particularly interesting, especially lately, because I think that if he were bald and wore a mustache, he would look very much like my friend and colleague Mike DeVivo. But, right, that's neither here nor there. In Tanner's narrative, he includes discussion of Anishinaabeg, right, of a two-spirited person named the Yellowhead, right, or Azab, right, Windib, okay, Ozah Windib. And other accounts have mentioned Ozah Windib too. He was a very famous person, right, in his era, in the 1790s and then in the early 1800s. Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, right, is a famous person in the history of Michigan and the Great Lakes, as a geographer and a geologist and as an Indian agent. And Schoolcraft, right, in his ethnographies, also wrote about Ozah Windib and commented that he was a two-spirit. Okay. Interestingly, Schoolcraft and Tanner both used the pronoun she when discussing Ozah Windib, and that she was a noted warrior, okay, as well as an Ogokwa, right, a man living as a woman. And this is interesting, right? When Tanner met the Yellowhead, she, right, Ozah Windib, right, a two-spirit, was about 50 years old and had been married previously multiple times. And when Ozah Windib met John Tanner, who was much younger, Ozah Windib took a special interest in Tanner. And he records this very explicitly in his narrative, and I thought that I would share it. He writes, "I do not know whether she had seen me or only heard of me, but she soon let me know she had come a long distance to see me with the hope of living with me. She often offered herself to me, but not being discouraged with one refusal, she repeated her advances until I was almost driven from the lodge. Old Netnokwa, his adopted mother, whom he loved and respected so much, old Netnokwa was perfectly well acquainted with her character and only laughed at the embarrassment and shame which I evinced whenever she addressed me. She seemed rather to countenance and encourage the Yellowhead in remaining at our lodge. The latter was very expert in the various employments of the women to which all her time was given." So anyway, the Yellowhead, Ozah Windib, right, takes an interest in Tanner, right, romantically, and Tanner, right, is you know, that interest is unrequited. But anyway, it goes on for a while. Ultimately, Ozah Windib leaves for a period of days in this section of Tanner's account and comes back in the middle of the winter with much needed supplies. Ozah Windib has, you know, to a starving community, supplied new resources, right, meat, and is hoping that Tanner will reconsider, and yet he cannot, right? And this goes on for quite a while, and Tanner is unsure of what he will do. And finally, right, at one point, right, the community in the middle of the winter, Ozah Windib, you know, whispers to Tanner one morning that I've spotted a moose, and Tanner had a gun, and so they went out into the forest, and Tanner took 2 shots at the moose and missed them both, and Ozah Windib was really disgusted. And after that, the romantic interest in Tanner sort of evaporated. He was disappointing, right, in a very important way, right? In the masculine gender behavior, right, he was found lacking and no longer desirable. And Ozah Windib would actually marry Tanner's father-in-law, and Tanner was fine with that. It's interesting for many reasons, but also because, you know, well, Tanner is not able to return the romantic interest of Ozah Windib, or the Yellowhead. He nevertheless is accepting and understanding of the gender, right, of the Yellowhead. And that's interesting, right? His use of the pronoun she shows that as a member of Anishinaabe culture, right, this is part of his world. This is part of his reality. In terms of an example of a woman living as a man, right, the most famous one in the history of the Anishinaabe is Hanging Cloud. Okay, her name, right, in Ojibwe, right, Hanging Cloud, Ashawe Gishigokwa, right, which I think is lovely, Ashawe Gishigokwa. And she was a woman who lived as a man, right, as an Ojibwe warrior in the region just south of Lake Superior. And Ashawe Gishigokwa was a warrior in every sense. She wore a man's clothing in many ways, right? She wore war paint. She carried full weapons of Anishinaabe warriors, which included spears, clubs, knives, and moose hide shields, right? She had all of these items. She took full part in battles and raids and in hunting parties. She was a member of the war council, right, in periods of crisis. She performed war dances. Right? She participated in all warrior ceremonies and became, famous for this. And became even more famous in the 1850s. Just shortly after her father died, her village was attacked by a rival group of Native Americans, and her village, was successfully defended. But she fought in that defense and killed a notable enemy, right, of her people. And later on, she was extremely proud of that part of her life, and often that's what will be reproduced later in the 1800s. And you see this sort of romanticized ideal here of the chief's daughter. And this is interesting. When this account comes out, and this image is published later in the 1800s, it's fit into sort of the dime novel pattern of the time. And she's not portrayed as a woman living as a man. Right? Her clothing has been changed, and she's in sort of the quintessential good Indian princess imagery. Right, of white racial stereotypes of the era. Okay, so that's somewhat misleading, right? As a woman living as a man, right, is in all the primary documents that reference her. Okay, her dress, her clothing, is a mixture, right, of masculine and feminine. Well, anyway, her life is a very interesting story because she's living at a time. She's still a young person in 1855 when the famous battle takes place, but she's living in a crucial time for the Anishinaabeg when the world is changing around them, right? And their culture is changing too. And she's also interesting, and she's an example of the variance, right? I mean, there are not hard and fast rules. I mean, this is gender flexibility, right? As a woman living as a man, right? If she chose a partner, you might expect her to choose a woman, right? Because she's a man, and you must partner with a woman for the sake of balance, except not always, right? I mean, it's very much about the individual. And when she does marry later on, she'll marry a man. Okay, even though she was, for a large part of her life at least, a woman living as a man. Right? She still chooses to marry a man. And I mean, her life is an interesting story. Eventually, her husband is rumored to be dead in the American Civil War, and she takes a second husband, and the first husband comes back and is very surprised that she's remarried, but they decide that she should stay with her second husband. But she lives on until 1919. And works through the last part of her life as a domestic servant for a major lumber baron in that region of Minnesota. So she lives at a special time when the world is changing very, very much. And whether you can attribute to her marrying a man as part of the gender variance that the Anishinaabe two-spirited often exhibited, or because of changing notions of culture, right, and acceptability in this new era, is difficult to describe. Okay. Colonization and change. This is where I'll take this, toward the end of our talk this morning.
I got a quick question.
Yes.
It appears when you're looking at Yellowhead that you have sexual orientation differences. I'm wondering if that can be subsumed under what you call heterogender, so that there's a place for the person who has what we would now call sexual orientation differences.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, the idea of sexual orientation, again, is not really part of Native culture. It's not part of their language or their worldview. But for ourselves, right, trying to understand that, there might be something to the parallel. Yeah, good. Sure, of course. But since European colonization, right, the existence of the two-spirit community has been often denied and attacked, right, alienated, right, from the Aboriginal identity of Native American people in the United States and First Nations people in Canada. And a part of that, right, it begins, right, with European churches and missionary groups, right? Missionaries come to this region, in particular the Jesuits, and they attempt to eradicate two-spirit individuals and their behaviors based on the church's moral code. And that creates a lot of issues, actually, in Native America. I mean, even for gender dynamics between men living as men and women living as women, the arrival of these new concepts, right, in a patriarchal culture like the French, right, and the Christian religion in general, right, very patriarchal, right, fathers rule heaven and earth, and that causes a difference, right, when some people, right, are going to have to accept, right, the coming of the whites and their Christianity, and in order to achieve needed trade compacts. This is going to split communities, right? Because the missionaries that come here are not tolerant of women's roles in Anishinaabe culture either, right? The idea of balance, right? That seems too much like equality, right? For those who've dedicated their lives to the study of the letters of St. Paul, and it's unacceptable. And so, right, you get men more often when people do start to convert to Christianity, right? You'll get more men in these early communities, right, from the Anishinaabe who will be welcoming to that message, and the women often will be hesitant because it means a loss of their place in society, So often communities, in the missionary period will split. And I have an excellent quote from a Great Lakes band that is going through this particular crisis. And the Jesuits are there to write down this speech, but it's delivered by men in a Great Lakes community to the women of their community. It is you women, 1640. It is you women who are the cause of all our misfortunes. It is you who keep the demons among us. You do not urge to be baptized. You must not be satisfied to ask this favor only once from the fathers. You must importune them. You are lazy about going to prayers. When you pass before the cross, you never saluted. You wish to be independent. Now know that you will obey your husbands. And that was a very powerful statement for an Anishinaabe man to make. You will obey your husbands? This is very foreign, right? And some communities in the early phase of missionary activity, some communities of Anishinaabe would split along gender lines. Right? The men would stay with the missionaries and the women would function independently. And ultimately, that's a very problematic situation to be in. But the arrival of new concepts, right, will slowly, over the course of hundreds of years, force the Anishinaabe people to adapt. Right? This two-spirit is targeted, as well as the position of women, right, and the balance that is so central to their worldview. And eventually, right, changes are going to continue, right, as they're forced, right, through increasing pressure to sign treaties, right, giving up land. Right, and eventually, throughout Michigan and other Great Lakes states, right, the native cultures, right, of this region will essentially be ghettoized in what are called reserves or reservations. The Saginaw Ojibwe, right, will be moved, be given a reserve in the interior of the state, and then others, located throughout. And when you move to a reservation, this is going to destroy the culture in many ways of forest people. Right? Because again, their culture and their life ways and their gender roles were tied to what they did, and that was determined by how to survive, right, in the Great Lakes, right, as forest people. You would move around with the seasons, and that determined your activities, and that determined your gender roles, and vice versa. Now that you've been forced into one place where you're no longer allowed to move, your life ways change, and so the traditional markers of masculine and feminine also change. Right? You're forced to give up that part of your identity and take on something new. Okay? The reservations stationed throughout the modern state, right, have an interesting history of their own. And it's a history of cultural genocide. Okay? And even after being moved onto the reservations, right, this process was incomplete. And of course, indigenous people, right, the Anishinaabe, would hang on to their language and their religion and as much of their gender roles as the new lifeways would allow. Right? But that was not acceptable to the now dominant culture. And so throughout the 1800s, you get continued methods of attacking, right, the power of women in Anishinaabe culture, right, which is to say balance, and the two-spirited. Okay? Toward the end of the century, the preferred mechanism for this is re-education camps or schools, right, called boarding schools or residential schools for Native Americans, right, often located near major reservations. This one here, created in the 1890s, is in the modern borders of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And it's going to function right up to 1929. And what they would do is remove the youth. Okay? The federal government, right, funded these schools. And they would remove the youth from their families, right, and re-educate them as the young. And this picture always chills me because of what you see is all these generations of little Anishinaabe children, the youngest at front and the older students at the back. And they were there, right, to have their old cultural ways eradicated and replaced with the cultural norms of the dominant society. Okay? People went in as Native Americans and came out, right, as members of the dominant culture. Okay? Same person. Okay? Before and after, right, re-education at Carlisle. They were taught to dress differently. They were taught to think differently. If they spoke their own language, right, they were punished. Right, their hair was cut, which normally for the Anishinaabe was only done during periods of mourning. It's a difficult time, but it's during this time period when a lot of the old concepts of gender, right, and the two-spirited is for a long time going to be lost. Eventually they canceled the schools, but the damage has been done. And then subsequently, throughout much of the 20th century, people refused. The elders were often, because of their experiences, they were afraid, right, to talk about older concepts of gender, right? And for a long time, the notion of the two-spirit, or the Nijmanaduog, almost disappears, right, from the discourse. And then in the 1990s, it's going to reemerge, which is, a nice, symbol of hope here, right, for North America that has endured so much horror in terms of ethnic cleansing and conflict. And it was Anishinaabe people, right, in particular in Canada, who were gay, right, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. They would start to reclaim this idea of Nijmanaduag, right, of the two-spirit. And I found that this has become very, very, it's not popular, but organizations calling themselves today Nijmanaduag, right, inclusive of Indian people, right, who are, gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender, have, widely proliferated around the country. And this is a way for them, by taking on this older spiritual concept and applying it to their modern identities, this is a way to honor their ancestral past and to overcome this period of history and reclaim their Aboriginal identity. And that's a very special thing, and it is growing. And so it's a nice sign, right, of a 500-year resistance to struggle, and resistance and struggle, right? They've retained their language, they've retained religion, and they've also, through long struggle, been able to retain notions of gender that predated the encounter with Europeans. Thank you. Time for a few questions.
If you have a question, we'd like to use the microphone so it can be captured on the camera. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. I'll pass the microphone down the aisle. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I might use this. Okay. You said that the Bear Clan was more for healing and stuff like that, like it would be seen in hospitals and stuff. But then you said the women were a big part of healing too. So was the Bear Clan made up more of women than men?
Both.
So
Right.
it was equal though? Okay.
Yes, yeah, and it would be, whatever your father's clan was, that's what you would inherit. As I say, they're patrilineal in most cases. Yeah, and the Bear Clan is actually one of the largest ones. It gets so large, in fact, that they will subdivide it right into head, heart, and feet, right, divisions of the Bear Clan. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you find the concept of the two-spirited in other Native American groups,
Yes.
and is that common? And if not, what was the view of those groups toward the Anishinaabeg?
Well, actually, I'm very glad that you asked that question, because the idea of the two-spirited, right, or men living as women and women living as men, is extremely common throughout Native North America. It's been documented in almost every culture. Right? Over 155 Native cultures have been documented as having the two-spirited people. Right? So it's an important part, not just of Anishinaabe. I chose to focus on the Anishinaabe as a particular case study. But yeah, it's a very widespread spiritual belief throughout Native North America.
Just as an added comment on that, John Stanzen-Timber, who was a Cheyenne, Shiala, in his account talks, I think it's before the wagon box fight, where they have a two-spirited dancer who is supposed to tell them what's going to happen that day. And he says, don't fight this day, you're going to lose. They didn't like the answer. They made him dance 3 different times until he came up with the answer they wanted. So there's kind of peculiar humor about that. The other thing I did want to touch on, just as a side comment, is that we do have powwow here at Riverside Park, and this culture is still very much alive. We've been hearing a lot of talk about they were, but there's still a lot that is, I guess is what I'd say. And it would be, if you haven't gone to it, I would say go. It's an amazing experience, very spiritually calming.
It is. And you'll find many people there who are willing to talk about issues of modernity, right, in Native life, right, and about the history.
Is the concept two-spirited the same as we have now, also known as transgender, or is it a completely different concept?
I would say that it's different, right? There's a connection, and I can see where your question came from. But the idea of transgender is more contemporary and more Western. With the Anishinaabe, the concept is more spiritually based as much as anything else, and it's very much focused on the life ways of a forest people. Okay? And so that's how they would consider and conceptualize the idea of the two-spirited, is through a religious sense as much as anything else.
And I quoted, are you saying like equality is a Western ideology when you're talking about the community and balancing out? Is that actually what the Anishinaabeg thought at that time, or is actually, are you referring to today?
Well, the idea of the rights of the individual and the focus on individual rights, I mean, that's something that emerges, after the encounter. It's germinating in parts of, what you might call European or Western civilization in the early 1600s, but it's not, by any regards, full-blown. But yeah, I mean, for the Anishinaabe, they wouldn't consider their political system, you might recognize a dimension of equality in their political system, but they wouldn't. They wouldn't use that word for it, right? It's not that everyone is the same, or that everyone has the same responsibilities or powers, right? But everyone is to make a contribution that is necessary and respected, and that they're to complement one another. So there's difference, and the difference is acknowledged. Not everyone is the same. Not everyone is equal. Some people are more influential than others based on who they are as individuals. But the contributions are ideally to balance. And so that's your cultural focus. That's your primary virtue, is the concept of balance. And again, that's not just Anishinaabe philosophy, that's fairly widespread throughout Native North America.
Other questions?
Thank you.
All right, let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
Dr. Inishab.
My pleasure.